name is Evelyn Diamond Banko, and I was born in Vienna, Austria on January 21st, 1936. My parents' name was Joseph Diamond, and my mother was Frida. She was called Fritzi, and her maiden name was Feelgood. And my dad was born in 1900, and my mother was born in 1904. I was born January 21st, 1936 in Vienna, Austria. I came from a relatively well-to-do family. My grandmother's brothers and sisters imported vegetables from Czechoslovakia, and they were pretty wealthy. They owned like 14 houses in Vienna and on the Danube River. And so when my mother and my father were married they were given a house to live in rent-free for 3 years. They didn't have to pay any rent. My dad was an engineer. He owned a business. He actually didn't do engineering at that point. He imported automotive parts and sold them in Vienna. And he and a man named Dieseldorf owned this business together. And they had a office right on the Danube in Rosalia-Linda-Strasse in Vienna, Austria. And my mother was a housewife. She played cards and had a really good life and went to the coffee house every day and was best friends with, she had 3 cousins that were about her age, and she was best friends with them, and they did a lot of things together. And her uncles used to take her on vacation to their houses on the Danube and to Italy and different places. And so she grew up pretty spoiled. My dad met my mother when my mother was 12 and he was 16. And he liked her immediately. And he actually used to walk her to her dates and kind of intimidated the other dates because he was just kind of around all the time. Except for he was going to college, of course, becoming an engineer, and then he spent a year or 2 in Hungary working for a relative in an engineering firm. But then Hungary made a law that anybody that wasn't Hungarian had to leave the country. So he came back to Vienna and eventually opened up this business of his own during that time. So until about 1933, when the Nazis came into power, they had a pretty good life. In March of 1938, the Nazis marched into Austria. It was an Anschluss. There was no war or anything. They just marched in. Lots of the Austrians cheered them on, and were very excited about Hitler becoming part of it. And Austria was annexed into Germany and became part of Germany at that time. Things had already become pretty bad for the Jews in Austria. And I know that my dad at one point was made to clean the sidewalk with I don't know what, but where he was probably kicked and shoved and made fun of and everything like that. But things were getting worse and worse. Austrian men were being picked up at night at their homes and taken to concentration camps. And at that time, they weren't killing camps, they were work camps, but they would just disappear. Sometimes they were brought back in a few days, sometimes they could pay a fee and get out. But at any rate, this was happening. And so my dad was trying to liquidate his business so he could leave the country. He was walking to work one day in August when some Nazi came up to him that liked my dad and said, "Don't go home tonight, you're going to be arrested." And so for the next 5 nights, I don't know exactly where my dad was, but I know that he went to his attorney and he found out that we could go to Riga, Latvia on a tourist visa. We didn't have an affidavit to come to the United States. You needed all kinds of papers and everything. We did have passports, of course. I was 2 years old at the time. My dad called my mother and told her to pack things up, and 5 days later we got on a train. My mother said we walked past all these people standing in line to get on, and she could just see that, you know, if you didn't have any money, you weren't going to get out of the country. I mean, we were paying people off to get where we were going. So we left for Riga, Latvia. Now, when the Nazis started coming into power, my parents went to what was called an Umschulung, which was kind of a reschooling, because you know, coming to the United States of America, there was no way that my dad was going to be an engineer the minute he got here. He couldn't go back to school to do, you know, get his engineering degree or anything like that. And so he had to be able to do something. So what he did was, my dad was very artistic, and he learned to design purses and belts. And my mother, who had never worked a day in her life, but she did go to a sewing school and get a paper saying that she had learned to be a really good dressmaker. So the purses and the belts, and so that was what helped us when we got to Riga, Latvia. Actually, some of our other relatives ended up in Riga, Latvia too, and so I think like 3 or 4 people were making the belts and the purses. My mother was staying at home with me and my cousin Susie, who also had ended up there. She was just a year younger than I am. My mother took care of the children while the other women and some of the men made the purses and belts and sold them to stores in Riga, Latvia. We didn't know anybody in Riga, Latvia, but while we were on the train going to Latvia, my dad started talking to somebody. My dad was really personable and always talked to people. And this man was an attorney, and he said he had a brother that lived in Latvia, and we should get a hold of him when we got there. And it turned out that they just became like family for us. We went over there for all the Jewish holidays, and they were very good to us when we were there. We also lived with one family in Riga, Latvia the whole 2 years we were there, and ate with another family. The family that we lived with, their house wasn't big enough for us to eat with them at night, but we ate with another family. And a group called HAIS, H-A-I-S, which is the Hebrew Aid Society. I don't know what it all stands for. They were the people that helped us along the way in Riga, Latvia, and eventually on our way to the United States too. We kept trying to get out of Riga, Latvia the whole time we were there, and we finally got an affidavit from a relative of a relative. My dad's sister married a Yugoslavian man, and his name was Gruen, and his brother, Otto Gruen, came to the United States and became a jeweler in New York City. And he was the one that sent us our affidavits. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to save his own family. They almost all of them died in concentration camp. I'll talk about them later. But he sent us the first affidavit we got. We were going to go through Sweden, and then the Germans marched into Denmark, and so we weren't able to go that way. At that point, my dad's sister, who was Yugoslavian, and Yugoslavia wasn't involved in the war yet, had sent us all our furniture and all our china and all that, or a lot of that stuff, to Riga, Latvia. And so when we were going to go through Sweden, we actually had a lot of our belongings that we had owned in Europe, in Vienna. And they had all been sent there, and they eventually went back to Riga, Latvia. The second time we got an affidavit was the next year in 1939, and we were going to go through Italy. Well, Italy was, of course, in cahoots with the Nazi Germany, and the war was declared between England and Italy, and so we couldn't go that direction either. So finally, in August of 1940, we heard about they were about 1,500 people, I think, were going to leave Latvia. What had happened is in the early part of 1940, the Russians marched into Latvia. We knew it was going to be either the Russians or the Nazis that came in, and for us, very luckily, it was the Russians. And from one day to the other, it was kind of like the Anschluss in Austria. The Russians marched in. There was no fighting at all. They took over Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and just marched in one day, and all of a sudden it was part of Russia. And the only thing I remember about that is that all of a sudden this man's picture was in every single store window. And of course it was Stalin, and his picture was put in all the windows in all the stores in Latvia. I also remember having an air raid where somebody tripped in the middle of the street, and my mother said if it had been a real war, they probably would have died. And we were looking at them out of the window of our apartment. Those are about my two memories of Latvia. So we lived there for those 2 years, and out of the 1,500 people that were given permission to leave Latvia were 23 Jewish refugees. My dad was put in charge of the group. Right before they were going to leave, the Russians took my father, an attorney that was going to be in our group of 23, and this doctor, Dr. Norbert Fell, who became our best friend when we came to the United States. And they kept them all night and interrogated them and promised them all sorts of things if they would stay, because they didn't want educated people leaving the country. So the Russians told them, they would stay there, they would do all these things for them. And finally, at the last minute, they said, well, we're going to let you go to America. We have a lot of people in the United States, and if we ever come to you, this is going to be our secret password, and we expect you to help us. And of course, my dad said yes, he would, and just to get out of the country. And I suppose if he had ever been in anything that might have been important to Russia, they might have tried to get him to be a spy, but since he opened up a service station, it was never a problem. But at any rate, then finally they said to him, okay, are you all ready to go? And my dad said yes, and he said, are your papers signed? And my dad looked, and they hadn't signed any of the papers. And so they were still giving him a hard time, but they eventually signed the papers, and they finally gave us our visas as we were boarding the train the next morning to get out of Riga. My mother, she always said stupidly, decided to get permission to take all the jewelry out of Riga, Latvia. We had a lot of jewelry. My dad loved buying jewelry for my mom, so we had quite a bit of diamonds ourselves. And also when some of our other relatives had given us some of their jewelry as they went into hiding and to escape in various places. And so my mother was trying to, because she had done this for other people, sew them into a belt and take them out of the country that way. But the friends that we had made and the other relatives that were there kept saying, think of you've got this daughter, and what if they take you off the train and they'll kill you and they'll kill your daughter and everything. So we left all this jewelry back except what we could wear. But what I started to say is my mother went to the Russian government, and she wanted to get permission to take all this jewelry, and she was told she could only take as much jewelry as she could wear. And so they gave her permission to take out what she could wear on her body. And so, one brooch and one ring and one watch and so on. And so as she was leaving the office building that she had gone into, she looked over one way and she saw them stuffing this man into a sack. this body into a sack. And as she was staring that direction, some of the Russians came and they just kind of turned her around and walked her out the other way out of the building. You know, just so she could pretend that she hadn't seen anything. So anyway, we left Riga, Latvia in August of 1940. And our first stop after that was Moscow. We went on the train from Riga to Moscow. On the train, my dad had already met this Dr. Fell because they were interrogated together the night before. And Dr. Fell and his wife had a daughter, Alice, who was just 4 years older than me. And so when we got on the train, my dad introduced my mother to Jenny Fell, and I started playing with Alice. And so the trip to the United States was wonderful for me because I had this friend who is still my friend that I still see all the time, who just wrote a memoir, and I'm in the memoir, but she changed my name to Trudy. But anyway, she and I became very close friends, and we also decided on this trip that wherever we ended up in the United States, the two families would go together because since we had no family anymore, at least we would know one person there. And so when we actually decided together to come to Portland, both families came. So we got on this train, and my mother had taken 2 diamond brooches, so she asked Jenny to wear one. And then when we got to the border between Russia and Latvia, there was no border. So we could have taken all our diamonds with us and had a little bit of money when we came to the United States to start a business or do something with, which of course we, couldn't do. So anyway, because we were going to go through Japan, we needed to have a visa. And since Japan was an ally of Germany, all the Japanese consulates in Europe had been closed except the Japanese consulate in Germany. So our passports were sent to Germany to get the visa, and when they came back, inside not only did it have the German eagle on it, but my father's middle name was made to be Israel, my mother's middle name was made to be Sarah, and my middle name was made to be Sarah. It was Evelyn Sarah. This is my parents. This was actually a traveling pass, different than a passport, but we had to have it too. Anyway, and this was every country that we went to was stamped, and it's full of stamps and stamps and stamps from all the different places we ended up. So we had to stay in Moscow for 3 days because the Trans-Siberian Railroad only ran on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so while we were there, my father and Norbert Fell and a couple other men went to the German embassy and asked them for money. And the Nazis that were there gave them all this Russian money because they said, all these rubles, because they said they knew that they weren't going to be there very long, that eventually they would be fighting the Russians. And it was just like worthless money to them. So my dad, who was the head of this group of 23 people, took this money and divided it up between all the Jewish refugees, and they went to go into the stores, and there was nothing to be bought in any of the stores. The stores were absolutely empty. And not only that, but every single night people would line up in front of all the office buildings. And one of the men in the group who spoke Russian asked them what they were doing there, and they said, "We wait there because we can sleep in the office buildings at night when they're through with their business." And so all these people were homeless with no place to stay. There was no food or clothing or anything to buy in the stores. There were just paper streamers in the windows. And somehow or other, my mother was walking down the street with me, and some Jewish man was selling shoelaces. And he said to my mother, "Don't stay here, get out of this country. If I were selling this shoelace for 1 kopeck more than what they tell me to, they would kill me. He said, this is a terrible place to be, and, you know, because he was Jewish and he spoke Yiddish. And so he told my mother this, and she remembered that to tell me as we were walking down. So then Tuesday came and we got on the Trans-Siberian Railroad. We went across Siberia, and it was no water virtually no water on the train. Everybody was thirsty. There was no way that you could wash yourself. My mother had taken a little metal wash basin to wash me in, and she had washcloths and stuff, so at least she could kind of give me spit baths. And people were really envious of her because not only did we have a wash basin, but my folks had taken their down comforters. And so we had down pillows and down comforters, and which came in very handy, especially in Japan when we were sleeping on the floor. We put them down on top of the mats, and so we had a little bit more of a floor, you know, to sleep on, some more comfort sleeping than the other people, because of course we weren't used to sleeping on mats on hard floors the way the Japanese were. So anyway, we got on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and by the last few days there was hardly any food, and it was all just terrible. By the last few days, all that was left was this canned food, mostly red caviar, which is very, very salty. And so we had very little water and all this salty red caviar as food for the last few days. While we were going through any of the military installations, they put these metal bars down on the windows of the train so you couldn't look through. And I remember wanting to peek out, and my mother telling me that if I looked out, I would be killed. So, you know, obviously I didn't look out the window. So, but Alice and I had a good time. We ran up and down through the train, and we chased each other around, and we played all kinds of games and everything. When we got to Manchuria, we got off the Trans-Siberian Railroad. In the entrance to Manchuria, there was like a no man's land in between. And so you had to get off the train on the one side and then carry all your luggage over this no man's land to the other side and then get on the Manchurian train. My parents had all these, you know, down comforters and pillows and blankets and suitcases and everything. The other stuff had been sent ahead to Japan to go on. The trunks had been sent ahead to Japan to go on the ship, and so we didn't have these. I remember coming to the United States with this big trunk, one of those old-fashioned steamer trunks that we had in our basement for years and years, and but it had been sent ahead, so it wasn't something that we had to carry with us. But suitcases and all the things that we needed every day were with us, the wash basin and everything. So then we were in Manchuria. We went to Harbin, and we stayed there for a few days, which was the capital of Manchuria, I guess. And then from there we went into China. When we got to Dairen in China, they were having a typhoid and a cholera epidemic. And everybody was wearing these masks on the street, and my parents were very, very afraid that I would end up getting cholera or typhoid from, you know, being in this country with this huge epidemic. Although we had shots, I found a form that we had that showed that at least my parents had typhoid shots. So they did have a shot at that time for that. So I don't know, you know, how well they worked in those years, but at any rate, they had those. So we went through China, and everywhere we went, every little town that we were in, there was somebody from HIAS waiting for us. And they would give us money for food and tell us a place to stay, whether it was a nice hotel or a gymnasium floor or whatever, but we had somewhere to stay. So we had to spend some time. We had to spend time in Dairen waiting for a boat to get to Japan. And my mother tells a story about when we were in China, we were staying in this house somewhere, and she looked out, and there was a European family in a house just across the way with a chandelier and a tablecloth on the table, and my mother wondered if ever we would be to the point where we would have chandeliers and tablecloths again. When we were in Japan, this family invited us to their house for dinner and a bath. And so we were able, my mother and I, my dad didn't go, but my mom and I were able to go have baths and actually be treated to dinner. I'm sure it was a Jewish family, not a Japanese family, but that was living there. But one of the speakers on the Speakers Bureau lived in Japan during the year, and he thinks that his family might have even been the people that invited us over to their house. Who knows? So I wouldn't know who they were. But anyway, the Jewish community over there in Kobe, Japan, did help the refugees as they went through. We had to spend time in Japan waiting for the boat, the ship that was taking us to the United States, which was a Japanese ship. And so we left Japan and got on this Japanese ship where we were in the bottom of the ship. We were like steerage. And we slept on the floors, and we were terribly seasick. Our first few days out, there was a typhoon, and you know, everybody was horrendously seasick, except my father and about 2 other men. They were the only people that through the whole voyage went every single day up to the restaurant to eat and got to eat the food in the restaurant. The rest of us were all in bed being seasick and trying to just eat. My dad would go up and try to get rice, and he would say, "Rice for my wife," and the Japanese would make fun of him. "Rice for my wife, rice for my wife." And they would the Japanese at that time did not like the Americans, and we were coming to America, so that they already did not treat us that well on the ship. And of course the food was very strange to us, having never ever eaten anything that was Japanese. So this, you know, raw fish and all this strange food was not at all like Austrian or Jewish food. And so, you know, rice was probably one of the few things that was recognizable that we could eat on our journey. So it took us about 6 weeks, starting from Riga, Latvia, before we arrived in America. Our first stop was Vancouver, BC, and my parents were so excited to be able to get off the ship in Vancouver, BC, and get on dry land. And we actually had relatives or distant relatives that had immigrated way earlier to Vancouver, BC, and were in lumber. They had been in lumber in Vienna, and they were in lumber there. Eventually, they were bought out by Weyerhaeuser, and they actually, one of the relatives had his name put on some building at the University of British Columbia because he gave him so much money. But we couldn't get off the ship because we had German passports. And anybody with a German passport, of course, couldn't get off a ship in Canada because Canada was at war with Germany. So we had to stay on the ship in the time that we were in port there. And so the very first thing we did, the day we got our citizenship papers, we drove all night and went to Vancouver, BC, and ended up there the next morning, the day after our citizenship papers, because we couldn't cross the border until 1946 when we were citizens of the United States. So that was our very first trip over there to visit the relatives that had gone there, which were distant relatives, not close relatives of ours. Anyway, so we ended up in Seattle. The ship went to Seattle, and we ended up in Seattle, and were put up in Seattle. And then we were given a choice because there was a Jewish quota on Jewish refugees. And the quota by September, we came to America on September 23rd, 1940. My dad turned 40 on September 26, 1940. So 3 days before my dad's 40th birthday, we came to the United States. My mother was 36 at the time. So here we were starting a new life with a 4-year-old daughter, and not knowing where we were going and what we were going to do. We were given a choice of going to Portland, Oregon, or San Francisco. And so my parents and the Fells decided that Portland was a smaller city, might be better opportunity for us, and it had mountains like Vienna. And so the two families then decided that Portland would be where we would end up. So we were supposed to be picked up the next morning along with the Fells. The people that picked up the Fells and took them to Portland and settled them in some house somewhere, and they forgot all about us. And so my parents contacted whatever group it was, whatever Jewish organization it was, and the next day they came and picked us up and took us to what was the Jewish neighborhood or the Jewish ghetto in Portland, Oregon, and put us up in this apartment house on 2nd Avenue. The lady that owned it was a Russian woman, and my mother was very, very well dressed and always looked, really, really sharp. And the woman, the first thing she said to my mother in Yiddish was, and you can read and write too, kind of like a put down, here you are, the refugees in our house, I can't read or write, but you can, and I'm taking care of you, sort of thing. And so that was kind of our introduction to the United States. I had the whooping cough. I got whooping cough when we got to Seattle. And so when we came to Portland, I couldn't go out to play. So I would look out the window of our apartment building every single day and see these children playing across the street, and I could hardly wait to go down there and start playing with them. Finally, I was declared to be well, and I ran downstairs and ran across the street to play with these children, and I couldn't understand a word they were saying, and they couldn't understand me because, of course, I spoke German, and they spoke English. And I yelled up to my mom, Mommy, ich verstehe nicht, which means I don't understand anything. And my mother yelled back, Evie, ich auch nicht, which is, I don't either, Evie. So, eventually I started at what was then called the Fruit and Flower Mission. It was on 10th or 12th downtown, nursery school when I was 4. My mother got the first job because she could sew. She was offered a job at Hirsch Weiss, which later became White Stag. But at that time it was called Hirsch Weiss, and it was over where the White Stag building eventually was off of Burnside. And my mother did piece sewing, and she was paid by the piece. Now, she was paid only $9 a week, whereas the other people were paid $12 a week because she was a Jewish refugee, even though it was owned by the person that owned the Hirsch Weiss was Jewish. But he paid the refugees less than he did the Americans. But my mother, the faster she got to work, the more they would give her to do. So, it was piecework and they paid you. So if you got really good with one needle, they gave you a machine with 2 needles. And then if you got really good with 2 needles, they gave you a machine with 3 needles. And, they'd have to do bigger and more piecework to get more money. But anyway, she was the one that got a job. And so that paid for our food, and our housing was paid for by whatever Jewish agency was giving us housing. And my mother kept going around every single day trying to find affidavits for her brother and her dad, her father. And she would meet with these Jewish organizations, and they would not help her. And finally, the first person that helped her was from First Christian Church. There was this marvelous woman, and I realized that everything always has to do with individuals, not organizations or groups or anything like this. But whatever this woman's name was, I wish I remembered her name, she just took care of us wonderfully. She got people to try to write affidavits for us. She gave me my first clothing, used clothing, American clothes, and she was just a wonderful woman that was, her thing to help the refugees. My dad became a janitor first. He was sweeping out buildings, and he would take care of me in the daytime when I wasn't in nursery school, and then was sweeping buildings. And then eventually he started working in a service station. And so he decided that he would open up a service station of his own. And so he contacted Texaco Company, was Texas company, and they were building a new service station on 17th Southeast 17th and Holgate, and they offered it to my father. Now this was still the end of the Depression. There were already 2 service stations on the other 2 corners. And so at first there wasn't much business. My father didn't speak English. He was opening up a service station. He really didn't know much about cars. There's kind of a funny story because when my father had his business in Austria, they owned a company car. The business owned a company car, and they had a chauffeur. Now my father knew how to drive, but Diesendorf, the other, his partner, didn't know how to drive. And one day my dad and my mother went to Schönbrunn, to the castle in Schönbrunn for the day, just for an outing. And this was before I was born. And the car had a flat tire. So my dad left the car on the street, called the chauffeur, and he and my mother took the streetcar home, and the chauffeur came and fixed the flat tire and took the car back to the office. So here's my dad, who's never fixed a flat tire in his life and never did anything with a car, all of a sudden, fixing flats, changing oil, doing all these things in a service station. The service station opened in 1940 and 1941. We opened the service station in early, probably like maybe April of 1941. My mother then went looking around the neighborhood looking for some place for us to rent a house near the service station. And she found this house that was for sale on what was called Reynolds Street off of Milwaukee and Holgate, Southeast Portland. And so she asked the people if they would rent it, and they said yes. And so we started to rent this house. Well, we had been living there maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and all of a sudden people started walking through this house. And my mother called the realtor, and they told her that the people had decided to sell the house. So my dad decided that we would buy it. He borrowed a few $1,000s from a customer as a service station, and we bought the house. And then the war started, December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor started. With the corner of 17th and Holgate was right next to Iron Fireman Foundry, the Portland Traction Company, which was the bus company, and the railroad. All 3 of them went on double and triple shifts. The service station across the street, the man went into the shipyards and closed the service station. The one next door, the man went into the Army, and it closed. My dad was the service station on the corner. He worked 10, 12, 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, and we did really quite well. Within 6 months of buying our house, we had paid it off. Then I started kindergarten at Brookland School, which was a school in the neighborhood, and after school I would walk to my dad's service station and stay there with him until my mother got off work about 6 o'clock. And then we would either go across the street to the Semaphore Diner and eat dinner, and my dad would be running back and forth every time a car came to get gas. He would sit by the window in the diner. If a car came, he'd run across and fill up the tank or do whatever he needed to do, and then come back and eat the rest of his dinner. Or my mother would walk me home then, and we would go home. So that was kind of the story of our coming to the United States. Eventually, my dad wanted to buy the service station, and Texaco just wanted him to lease it. They wouldn't let him buy it. One of the salesmen that came into my dad's service station worked for a company called Niehoff, and he saw how educated my dad was, and he said, this is really not the place that you should be. Why don't you come work for Niehoff? And so my dad went down and interviewed for this job. They sold ignition parts for automotive parts. And my dad interviewed with them and was hired and became a salesman. So for the rest of his life, he sold automotive parts, which is kind of what he started with in Vienna and ended with here. So that's kind of the story of our trip to the United States. I was an only child, but my parents had huge families. My grandparents both came from large families. My mother's mother was one of like 12 or 13 children because one of her mother had died and her father remarried. So he had two wives and he had children with both families. So we had this huge families, and part of the family was the wealthy part of the family that my, her brothers became wealthy, and they really were very good to my mother. And my dad, the same thing. My dad family originally were farmers in Czechoslovakia. My dad was born in Gaia, Czechoslovakia, on a farm, but they went to to Austria, and they also were importers and salespeople. I don't know exactly, but they were fairly middle class, fairly, not rich but not poor either. But they were from a very large family, lots of cousins and uncles and aunts. My dad had a very big family. So what I lost was all these people that would have been my friends. And in fact, my mother's two best friends were her two cousins. Well, she had three cousins about her age that she was really good friends with. And two of them, one had a daughter a year older than me and one had a daughter a year younger than me. So I would have grown up with three cousins that were within, we would have been within 2 years of each other in age. And one lives in London now and one lives in Connecticut. But they both survived the war. This whole family was taken away from us. I never had any. My grandparents died in concentration camps. My uncles and aunts died in concentration camps. My father's mother and father went back to Czechoslovakia, and they had relatives on a farm, and they went to live in Czechoslovakia, and eventually were picked up. I don't know exactly where they died or how they died, but I know that they did. When I was in Czechoslovakia, when I was in Prague, we went to the Jewish section of Prague, and I didn't know what was in there, but went to the Jewish section and was walking through the various buildings, and one of the buildings was a synagogue that had been made into a memorial. And when I walked in there, there were 23 diamonds on the wall in there. And I figured that most of them were my relatives, and the first two names that were on the wall were my grandparents. So those were the people that were picked up in Czechoslovakia. Some of them were from Prague, and some were from a town called Brno. And so, it was very emotional to all of a sudden see these names on this wall when I didn't even know what the building was and didn't expect to see anything in there. So that was very hard. My father's sister, whose name was Hilda, had married a Yugoslavian man. His name was Gruen, and I think I said that his brother Otto was the one that got us our affidavit. And so they went back to Yugoslavia and eventually were picked up and put in a concentration camp in Yugoslavia. The concentration camp was called Jasenovac. I know I don't pronounce it right, but however it was pronounced. It was a Croatian concentration camp. They picked up mostly Serbs in that camp and put them into it, but they also picked up Jews. And so the first person that was picked up was my dad's sister's husband. And he was taken into that camp, and he died within a year and a half of being in there because the camp was a horrible camp. They didn't have much food, and they were mistreated, and they were taken out and killed too. So I don't know exactly, whether he was killed or whether he died of starvation or what. But anyway, he died. Eventually, my dad's sister and my dad's niece and my dad's nephew were picked up and taken to exactly the same camp. By the time they got to the camp, my dad's sister's husband had already died. But they were put in the camp. Now, my dad's sister and her daughter, who was probably in her the daughter was probably in her early 20s, late teens, early 20s, were put to work, I think, on on when I read the stuff in German, I think was like a farm. My dad's nephew, Walter, was studying to be an electrician when you had all this stuff with, what are you going to do if you go to a strange country? Everybody wanted to do something that they could do with their hands, and so he studied to be an electrician, and he was about 17 at that time, I think, and so when he went into the camp, he had it a little bit easier because he had a skill that they needed. And not that it made it easy, but when I say easier, I don't mean easy. But at least he was given, perhaps a little bit more food, a little inside, working inside instead of outside, all that kind of stuff, So they were in the camps, and eventually my dad's sister and her daughter died in the camp. Walter was there toward the end of the war, and in 1945, as the war was going down, they knew that the Croats there were going to kill all the remaining prisoners. And so there was an uprising in the camp, and I see different numbers everywhere. Walter said about 1,500 people were in the uprising. I've read papers that said hundreds. I've read papers that said more or less. So I don't know exactly how many people were in the uprising. What I do know is that less than 80 escaped. And one of the ones that escaped was my cousin Walter. And he was picked up by the communists, the partisan group, and nursed back to health because he was all skin and bones. And eventually he found an aunt of his and went to live with her. And my parents tried to get him into the United States, but there were so many rules and regulations and quotas and everything. My dad really wanted to buy this service station, have Walter come over and work in it with him, because here was this young man who would have been perfect to have. The two of them could have, bought this service station or some service station. And my dad by then was getting older, At 1945, he was 45. I mean, he wasn't that old, but not a spring chicken again anymore. And so Walter could have helped him in the service station. The two of them would have worked it together, and that was really his plan, but he never could get Walter out. Walter eventually immigrated to Israel. And after my dad died in 1981, and my mother and I in 1982 went to Europe. She showed me around Vienna where I was born and all the places that I'd been. We went to London and met my cousin Razel, who changed her name to Teresa, who was the one that was a year older than me. And then we went to Israel and met my relatives, my dad's side of the family in Israel. And I got to meet Walter and his wife there. So he died last year of cancer, but his wife is still living, and he has children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren in Israel. So, so he was the only one of that side of the family that survived. My mother tried all through the war to try to get her brother Max and her dad out of Vienna. She had a picture of Max on her dresser, a big, picture that was on her dresser her entire life, that she looked at every single day. She never could get over the fact that she couldn't save his life.